Welcome to Nottingham. With me is Dr. Harith bin Ramli, who teaches Islamic studies, and he's going to try and address the question, what is Sufism, and give us an introduction to it as a religious system and as a theology. Harith, why study Sufism?
Sufism is a very popular dimension of Islam. It's usually described as the mystical tradition of Islam. Many people tend to associate it with the popular image of the whirling dervish and so on. So many people are drawn to Sufism because it's considered to be the kind of peaceful, tolerant, perhaps more artistic dimension of Islam. But I think it's much broader than that, actually. When you look at the wider history of Islamic thoughts or Islamic history in general, Sufism actually plays a large role in social, historical developments, political developments even, and even has a great impact on the development of Islamic theology, particularly after about the 10th century AD. So studying Sufism is really essential if you want to get to understand the wider history of Islam as a whole.
Tell us something about Sufi thought.
Okay, perhaps the most common way of explaining Sufism is by a tradition, a famous tradition narrated about the Prophet, and the story goes that the Prophet was sitting with a number of his companions, and suddenly a stranger appears out of nowhere, and no one knows him, and it doesn't look like he's been traveling, because I guess if he was a stranger, he'd normally be, wearing something very dusty. So people are a bit surprised by this guy, and he comes in and he sits down and he starts asking the Prophet questions. He asks the Prophet to describe what Islam is, and the Prophet replies with the kind of answering about the 5 pillars of Islam: prayer, testimony of God and Muhammad as a messenger of God, prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage. Then he asks the Prophet to define the nature of faith, and the Prophet answers, faith is believing in God, the prophets, the holy books, angels, predestination, and the day of judgment. And finally, he asks the Prophet, what is the perfection of all these things? The word he uses is ihsan, which could mean, is related to the idea of beauty, perfection, goodness, and so on. And the Prophet says, to worship God as if you could see him, even though you can't see him, he sees you. And that's often, this dimension called ihsan has often been used by Sufis to explain what Sufism is in relation to the wider Islamic tradition. Essentially, it's a perfection, fulfillment of the law and the beliefs that are required of the everyday average Muslim. Sufism had developed as a tradition in the 3rd century of Islam. So we're talking about the 9th century AD. And it arose out of an ascetic tendency that develops pretty soon after the life of Muhammad. Some people say as a reaction against kind of the growing immorality. After Muslims kind of became more successful, powerful, and richer, many Muslims kind of moved away from that and developed a more ascetic tendency. Sufism develops a few centuries after that, absorbing elements of that ascetic tendency, but also developing a very intricate language of the inner journey to God. So whereas ascetics would talk about fear of God, withdrawal from the world, Sufis would kind of elaborate on that and talk about further states, spiritual states that develop once you purify yourself, once you kind of fulfill the religious laws and you live a more ethical lifestyle. You start to kind of see things beyond the kind of vision of the average believer. And Sufism develops a kind of language to explain the steps as you get closer and closer to God and you start to live that thing referred to in the tradition that I mentioned earlier. In fact, I forgot to add that tradition, in that tradition, basically after the man leaves, the Prophet actually tells his followers, that was Gabriel, right? So Gabriel appeared in the form of a kind of mysterious stranger to teach the Muslims about the kind of wider dimensions of their faith. So one can add, of course, that the Sufi tradition developed its own particular language and approach, which might be distinct in many ways from the usual approach to Islamic law, Islamic theology. And this, of course, brought about certain disagreement and sometimes even conflict with Muslims who didn't feel that this tradition that was developing really fit into their understanding of what Islam was. Later on, of course, as Sufism becomes more popular and the figure of the Sufi master becomes more and more important, he almost starts to kind of the Sufi master almost starts to kind of develop an aura which is similar to that of a kind of saint in many other traditions. And this also leads to problems because people start to see Sufism as a justification of worship of men, basically. And on the popular side of Sufism, many kind of supernatural tales start to, be told about these Sufi saints or Sufi masters. Some involving them flying or even teleporting to another part of the world. So we have the kind of ideal classical side of the Sufi tradition, but we also have the popular side that develops. And this, of course, also raises controversy with certain Muslim theologians who find that this doesn't really fit within the kind of monotheistic vision of Islam.
And when this vision of the Sufi masters as saints develops, does that take on some of the popular format that, say, Christian history would be familiar with, whereby the place where the saint lived becomes a place that people want to go to, and the keeping of relics and the maintenance of the memory of the saint as somehow protective?
Absolutely. I mean, in many places in the Muslim world up to today, the shrines of where these saints are buried are considered to be holy places for the people who visit them. They're sources of blessing known as barakah. And people often go there to also meditate and contemplate. And there's this belief that you can actually contact the spirits of these saints from the other side. And there are many Sufi paths that actually even have they place quite a lot of importance in connecting to these earlier masters.
So Sufism has this two-sided aspect, two aspects. On the one hand, it's the mystical tradition. It is the religion beyond the religion, and on the other hand, it's the cult of Islamic saints.
Yes. Well, the first one is a bit complicated. I mean, I'm not entirely always sure whether the term mysticism is always going to be useful. I mean, I think it's insofar as we try to kind of compare different religious traditions, the word mysticism is useful. But Sufism seems to have much more than just mysticism, I think. So, but broadly speaking, yes, I would agree that there is this kind of ideal tradition and there's a popular dimension to it as well.
And how does Sufism manifest itself in Islam today?
Well, there are various reasons why in many Muslim societies, Sufism has kind of gone into decline or even gone underground. One of the reasons is the rise of certain reformist tendencies, particularly in the 18th century. There was a movement called labeled as the Wahhabiyya. They wouldn't call themselves that. They considered themselves to be reformers of Islam. And they found that many practices associated with Sufism, particularly the shrine worship we just talked about, to be outside of the boundaries of Islamic belief and practice. So many of them have actually been actively campaigning against Sufi practices around the world. So perhaps I can give you an example. In Saudi Arabia, for example, where this kind of Islam is much more dominant, there is still Sufism, but it's usually more hidden, more underground. But if you go to countries like Morocco or even Indonesia, where these currents do exist but are not as dominant, then you will find kind of medieval forms of Sufism, saint veneration, shrine visitation being practiced quite actively among members of the population.
When the word Sufism comes up, there are 2 points that I think are always spring to mind, and you mentioned one of them already, and that is the whirling dervishes. Can you explain the link between the whirling dervishes? We even see them on adverts for right. Turkey on the television, yes, tourism adverts. Yeah. Can you explain that?
Okay, so the whirling dervishes specifically are a group of Sufis. So around about the 14th century, we see the rise of institutions known as the Sufi orders. Prior to that, we had Sufi masters in different places teaching Sufism, and Sufis did talk about different methods to approach God. But around this period we're talking about, there is more of a systematic attempt to kind of formulate a path with a very clear lineage, going back to the Prophet Muhammad usually through several important Sufi masters. Now the whirling dervishes are one such path or order, known as the Mevlevis. Originally they were based in Turkey, associated, I don't know if you've heard of a guy called Rumi, a famous kind of poet. I think from the 19th century onwards many of his poems were translated to English and other European languages. So he basically, he was a very important Sufi figure in his time, and it's not clear whether he decided to establish a Sufi order inspired by his teachings, but we certainly know that later on, generations that came after him, members of his family, started to formulate a very clear institution order which was linked to his teachings. And the idea is that these teachings were also linked to previous Sufi masters going back to the Prophet Muhammad. But perhaps the question you would like to be answered is why they're dancing, why this particular way of dancing. So generally speaking, many Sufis associated with the emphasis on remembering God. It's a practice known as zikr. I mean, mainstream Muslims practice it as well, usually after prayer, reciting certain names of God and so on to kind of remember Him. The Quran tells Muslims to remember God constantly. Over time, Sufis developed certain kind of unique approaches of how to do this, and often this would involve dancing and music as well. So the Mevlevis do this. They do this basically as an act of remembering God, but also to signify the kind of ecstasy of discovery at discovering the beloved, which is essentially God. So the idea is you walk along the Sufi path and you annihilate your worldly, your egotistic side, and once this has happened, you start to see the other side of things. And there's something very beautiful about this encounter which makes people excited and want to dance and express their joy, sometimes uncontrollably.
Okay. The other interesting thing is the word, I've heard it said, and I'm asking you as the expert, that our word sofa for a couch is actually
Sufa
related.
from Arabic.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there are many different explanations given why Sufis are called Sufis. One such explanation is that some of the Prophet's companions, who were known for being very pious and even had ascetic tendencies, used to congregate on the benches of the mosque, behind the mosque. So they were known as the people of the benches. Okay. The word used is the Sufa, the people of the Sufa. And the Sufis are considered to be kind of a development from these types of people. So Sufis are in a sense the people of the sofa, but not couch potatoes.
Okay, well, that's what a lovely point to end on. Harith, thank you very much. Thank you.